But lawmakers still want to enforce a subpoena to compel her deposition regarding the Epstein investigation. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying that's nice, still does not get her out of testifying to Congress about Epstein. We must also investigate the continued breaking of the law around the DOJ still hiding Epstein files from the public. This is not over.
The statement is direct, measured, but politically significant. Because once a sitting lawmaker frames the issue in terms of subpoenas and potential legal violations, the story shifts. It is no longer just a personnel change inside the Department of Justice. It becomes a question of transparency, accountability, and institutional trust. Today, we examine the record, what was said, what can be established, and what remains contested. At the center of this case is a convergence of events, a reported leadership change at the Department of Justice, ongoing scrutiny surrounding the handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files, and competing claims about whether information was fully disclosed to the public. The allegation being raised is serious, that key Epstein-related records may have been withheld. The response from officials is equally clear, that the DOJ released all relevant material and that the leadership change is unrelated. The question is not just what happened. The question is what the record supports and what it does not.
But Bondi has been under public scrutiny, especially as it relates to her handling of the Jeffrey Epstein case. The Justice Department eventually released millions of pages of documents, but no definitive client list. Still, interim AG Todd Blanche is brushing off the notion that Bondi's ousting had anything to do with Epstein.
Let us examine the record. Millions of pages released, but no confirmed client list. That detail matters because it creates a credibility gap between expectation and outcome. For critics, the absence of such a list raises questions about completeness. For defenders, it suggests that no such verified document exists within the evidentiary record. What can be established is this: the documents were released, but the interpretation of what is missing remains contested, and that distinction is critical. To understand how this situation unfolded, we need to follow the sequence. First, the Department of Justice releases a large volume of Epstein-related material. Second, public and political attention focuses not on what was released, but on what was not found. Third, scrutiny intensifies around leadership decisions and accountability. Finally, a leadership transition is reported, raising questions about motive and timing. Now, the timeline becomes critical, because once scrutiny over Epstein files overlaps with a DOJ leadership change, the narrative becomes politically charged. But correlation is not causation, and that is where the record must be handled carefully.
We're speaking at panels that were talking about the scourge of illicit fentanyl coming into our country and trying to bolster communities. Pam had been in the greater Tampa area and for the state of Florida, a very active advocate for trying to prosecute those that were trafficking in the illicit substances.
This is where the story widens, because beyond the Epstein controversy, the Department of Justice operates across multiple fronts: drug enforcement, public safety, community impact. The testimony introduces a human dimension: loss, advocacy, and policy response. And it serves as a reminder. Institutional performance is not judged on a single issue alone. But in moments of controversy, public trust tends to collapse across the entire system. And this is where the stakes rise, because when confidence erodes in one area, it can spread to all others.
It doesn't give me a lot of comfort that it's Todd Blanche, who's now the acting Attorney General of the United States. This is the guy who transferred Ghislaine Maxwell from the higher security prison to the low security prison camp in Texas, and has arranged for a very sweet landing for her there.
Now we turn to power, because leadership is not just about authority, it is about credibility. The criticism here focuses on past actions and perceived leniency. Whether those claims are fully substantiated in this transcript is not independently proven. But politically, they function as a challenge to legitimacy. And that matters. Because in institutional systems, perception can influence trust as much as evidence. The question becomes, who controls the narrative, And who defines credibility? The defense position, as presented in the record, is structured and consistent. Officials state that the president's decision was based on leadership considerations, not on Epstein-related issues. They further maintain that all relevant DOJ files regarding Epstein were released, and that officials answered questions publicly. From this perspective, the controversy is being overstated, and the leadership change is routine, not reactive. That explanation deserves scrutiny, because while the defense separates the leadership decision from the Epstein issue, the timeline places them in close proximity. And in public affairs, timing shapes perception. The record does not independently prove intent, but it does show overlap. And that overlap raises legitimate questions. Not conclusions, but questions. Which is precisely where democratic accountability begins. From a legal standpoint, two key mechanisms are referenced. First, subpoenas. A subpoena is a formal legal demand requiring testimony or the production of documents. Failure to comply can carry legal consequences, but enforcement depends on institutional follow-through. Second, evidentiary disclosure. The release of documents does not automatically resolve a case, because disclosure raises a further question. Was the release complete or simply sufficient under legal standards? And those are not always the same thing. This is where the case becomes broader than any individual, because the central issue is not just leadership, it is institutional trust. If one side believes documents were withheld and the other insists full transparency was achieved, then the system faces a credibility divide, and that divide has consequences. For Congress, for the Department of Justice, for public confidence. This is the institutional failure at the center of the case, not necessarily proof of wrongdoing, but evidence of a system struggling to maintain trust under scrutiny. What can be established from the record is this. A DOJ leadership transition occurred. Epstein-related documents were released in large volume. No confirmed client list emerged from those disclosures. Lawmakers are pursuing further testimony through subpoenas, and competing narratives remain unresolved. What cannot be established from this transcript alone? Definitive proof that documents were intentionally withheld, a direct causal link between the leadership change and the Epstein controversy. The case, therefore, remains open, not legally closed, not politically settled. The evidence speaks, but not conclusively. And in a system built on accountability, when the record leaves questions unanswered, the investigation does not end.